1891. The western sky darkened with steel-gray clouds as a cold wind swept across the fading grasslands. Isabel Carter knelt by the corner post of her fence, hammer in hand, struggling to drive a stubborn nail before dusk slipped away. The boards creaked in the chill, a familiar sound marking years of hard work trying to hold her land together. The nail bent on her last strike. She muttered, pulled it free, and straightened when 3 sharp knocks echoed from the house. The knocking came again, louder, urgent, carried by the wind. Isabel left the hammer and walked quickly to the porch, the cold whipping her coat and loosening her hair. At the door, she froze. 2 little girls stood side by side, barely 6, their cheeks flushed red and braids tangled in the breeze. Their small boots stood firm on the worn boards despite the cold. The girl on the left lifted her chin and said plainly, "We heard you needed a man on the ranch. Our papa loves you." Isabel blinked in surprise. "Your papa loves me." "Yes," the girl said confidently. "He's good with horses, fences, and shoots better than anyone." The other twin clutched a worn leather satchel, her wide eyes alert and wary. Isabel took in their threadbare wool coats, cracked boots, and mittened hands. "Where is your father?" "At the cattle camp by the river," the first replied. "He's too busy to come here, but we came." "You came all this way?" Isabel glanced beyond them, seeing only the empty yard and the muddy road stretching toward the cottonwoods. The quieter twin finally spoke, her voice small but clear. "It's not far. We know the way." Isabel crossed her arms, torn between caution and the strange pull she felt. "Do you always walk up to strangers' doors?" "You're not a stranger," the first insisted. "Papa talks about you." Her breath caught. She couldn't imagine why a man she'd never met would speak her name to his daughters. "And your names?" "I'm Sophie," the bold one said, touching her chest. "And she's Clara." The wind rattled the window shutter, and Isabel saw both girls shiver despite their resolve. She thought of sending them back. Dusk was falling, frost creeping in, but then noticed Sophie's red knuckles and Clara's trembling lips. "Come inside," Isabel said, stepping back. "Both of you." They exchanged a glance, then hurried inside. Isabel closed the door against the wind and led them to the kitchen. "Sit by the hearth," she said, coaxing the embers to life. The fire brightened quickly, casting warmth around the room. She hung the kettle and set a pot nearby. Sophie and Clara settled clothes on the braided rug, their boots leaving faint muddy prints on the floor. Isabel didn't mind. "What exactly did your father say about me?" she asked while stirring flour into a bowl. Without hesitation, Sophie answered, "That you work harder than most men, don't scare easy, and need someone to count on." Clara added softly, "He said you're kind." Isabel paused, then resumed stirring. "And your father's name?" "James Rowan," Sophie said. "He said, if you meet him, you'll understand." Isabel looked at the 2 girls, identical faces, one steady, one cautious, waiting for her reply. Outside, the wind rattled the walls, but inside, the fire's warmth grew. She could send them back or give them a moment to rest and speak. "Tea will be ready soon," she said finally. "Then you'll tell me everything." The wind had settled into a low, constant moan by the time the knock came. Isabel was clearing the cups from the table. The twins, tucked up on the rug near the hearth, their eyelids heavy from heat and full bellies. The knock was firm, 3 measured raps that carried through the quiet. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. A man stood on the porch, his hat brim shadowing his eyes, shoulders squared against the cold. He was tall, easily a head above her, and carried the kind of presence that made the space feel smaller around him. Dust and trail grit clung to his coat. When he spoke, his voice was deep, even, and polite. "Evening, ma'am. I'm looking for my daughters." Behind her, the girls stirred at the sound. Sophie popped her head around the doorway, grinning. "Papa." Clara followed, slower but smiling. Isabel stepped aside, allowing them to rush to him. They wrapped themselves around his legs, chattering about the fire and the bread and the cat that sometimes prowled by her door. James Rowan, because she had no doubt this was him, rested one hand briefly on each of their heads before looking back to her. "I'm sorry if they caused you trouble." "They didn't," Isabel said, though her tone was cooler than the words. She crossed her arms. "What they did do was walk here alone in the wind. It's nearly a mile from the cattle camp, and it's dark now. His gaze met hers, steady and without defensiveness. I know. They've done it before. I tell them not to, but they don't always listen. They're strong-willed. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, then faded. Tonight, I was moving cattle back from the river. By the time I noticed they were gone, someone at camp said they'd seen 2 small boots heading this way. You should keep them closer, she said, sharper than she intended. The image of those thin coats against the wind was still too fresh in her mind. He inclined his head slightly. You're right, and I appreciate you letting them in. The girls were still talking over one another, Sophie telling him about the tea, Clara about the honey she'd stirred into hers. He listened without interrupting, one large hand on the back of each small coat, anchoring them. I'll take them home now, he said finally, urging them gently toward the door. Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but he gave her a quiet look that settled her. At the threshold, Isabel noticed something shift in his posture. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and set a small burlap sack on her table. The cloth was worn but tied neatly with twine. Beside it, he placed a glass jar wrapped in paper. She frowned. What's this? Flour, he said simply, then tapped the jar. Honey, for your trouble. That's not necessary. His eyes flicked from her to the fire, where the last glow lit the room. Maybe not, but take it anyway. Before she could argue further, he guided the girls out onto the porch. Sophie turned to wave. Good night, Miss Isabel. Clara echoed her softly, their voices carrying into the chill. James touched the brim of his hat to her, a gesture polite enough to feel like it belonged to another time. Good night, ma'am. Then he stepped into the dark with his daughters, their shapes swallowed quickly by the night and the muted crunch of boots on the frosted ground. Isabel closed the door, the latch clicking into place. She stood a moment longer in the quiet, the wind pressing against the walls. The burlap sack and the jar sat on her table, humble but unexpected. She untied the twine. The flour was clean and fine, the honey thick and golden even in the dim lamplight. She could picture him, setting them down without fuss, as though payment and gratitude were the same thing. The fire popped in the hearth, and she thought of the way he had listened to his daughters, patient, intent, before guiding them away. It had been a long time since she'd seen a man who didn't fill silence with noise. Isabel tucked the flour away and set the honey on the shelf. She would use it sparingly, she decided, though not because she needed to save it. Something about the weight of that jar felt more than just the food inside. Outside, the wind carried off the last sound of their footsteps. Dash dash dash. Morning sun spilled over the ridge, turning the frost on the fence rails into 1,000 tiny mirrors. Isabel stepped out with a bucket of feed balanced on her hip, the air crisp enough to cloud her breath. 2 small figures were already at the chicken coop, crouched low and giggling as the hens darted for stray kernels. Sophie spotted her first, springing up with a wave. We came early. Papa said we could. Clara, quieter but with the same spark in her eyes, held out a palm full of grain like an offering. Isabel smiled despite herself. Looks like you've got things well in hand. They worked together, scattering feed until the hens settled into a contented cluck. When the bucket was empty, Sophie insisted on helping with the garden pump. The handle creaked as they worked it, water splashing into the tin pail. Clara steadied it with both hands, her mittens darkening with wet. Later, while carrying the pail toward the porch, Isabel noticed something she hadn't before. The coop's door, which had been hanging loose for weeks, now swung smoothly on its hinges. The wood had been planed where it had warped, the nails driven flush. No one had said a word. The next day, she found the far stretch of the fence mended, posts straightened, rails secure. The job was neat, the kind of work that took more care than time. And on the morning after that, a clean bucket of water sat by the well, its rim catching the early light, though she hadn't filled it. James never mentioned these things. There was no note, no casual, "You're welcome," slipped into conversation. They simply appeared, the way the frost melted from the fields or the sun found its way through the kitchen window, quiet, certain, and without demand. Sophie and Clara became as regular a sight at the ranch as the barn cats. They trailed Isabel through her chores, small boots crunching in the yard, hands quick to gather eggs or sweep seed husks from the porch. Sometimes they chattered about school or the calf born last spring. Other times, they simply worked beside her in companionable silence. In town, though, the air shifted. Isabel felt the looks before she heard the words, long glances over shoulders, conversations that dipped as she passed. The first time she caught the edge of it, two women near the mercantile were bent over a bolt of calico, one whispering into the other's ear. The other's eyes flicked toward her, then away. At the post office, an old ranch hand with tobacco-stained fingers asked how Rowan's ladies were doing, and when she frowned, he only grinned and tipped his hat. The talk wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. In a town this small, things had a way of moving faster than the stagecoach and sticking longer than the dust on Main Street. Back at the ranch, the twins were chasing a wayward hen, their laughter carrying across the yard. Isabel leaned against the porch rail, watching as Clara nearly caught it before Sophie's boots slipped in the mud, and both tumbled into a heap. She should tell them to be careful, to keep clean, to remember they'd have to walk home in those clothes. But she didn't. She only smiled at the sight and wondered, not for the first time, what it was in their father's eyes that had shaped them so. When the sun dipped low, painting the fields in amber, she carried the day's eggs into the kitchen. A faint scent of fresh-cut pine lingered near the door. She glanced down and saw the porch step, newly replaced, the wood pale and smooth under her boots. Another quiet repair, another unspoken gesture. She set the eggs on the counter and stood there a moment, hands resting on the worn wood, thinking about the man who moved through her world like this, leaving no mark but the ones that held things together. The autumn market bustled with color and noise. Stalls lined the main street of town, bright with pumpkins, baskets of apples, and jars of honey catching the sunlight. Isabel arranged her own produce neatly, rows of pale orange squash, red apples polished to a shine, and honey sealed tight in glass. The cool wind carried the smell of roasting chestnuts and the chatter of neighbors bartering over prices. Across the way, a group of men lounged near the saloon's outdoor table, tankards in hand, their laughter carrying above the hum of the market. One of them, broad-shouldered, his hat tipped low, peeled away from the group and sauntered toward her. Mick Dalton. His name traveled ahead of him, tied to too many stories about women who wished they'd never spoken to him. "Well, now," Mick said, stopping at her table, "those are some fine apples. Bet you're not just here selling fruit, though." Isabel kept her voice steady. "A bushel is 50 cents. If you want less, it's 5 cents apiece." He leaned his elbow on the table, close enough that she caught the sharp scent of whiskey on his breath. "I reckon a lady like you could make more than that, if she was in the right company." Isabel turned toward a woman who'd been examining her squash. "Ma'am, these will keep for weeks if stored in a cool cellar." She spoke clearly, hoping Mick would take the hint. But he didn't move. "Word is you're running that big place all by yourself. Hard work. No man to help. That true?" His voice had risen, drawing glances from nearby stalls. Isabel felt heat prick her neck, though the wind was sharp. "Mr. Dalton, if you're not here to buy." A shadow fell over the table. "He's not here to buy," came a quiet voice from behind her. James Rowan stepped up, his frame blocking the view of half the street. He didn't raise his voice, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. His left hand rested lightly on the table's edge, the muscles in his forearm shifting under his rolled-up sleeve. "You're standing in the way of paying customers," James said evenly. "Best move along, unless you're looking to have fewer teeth than you came with." Mick's smirk faltered. "Just making conversation." James didn't blink. His fingers curled slightly, tightening on the wood. The corner of the table gave a soft creak under the pressure. The laughter from the saloon table had gone quiet. Mick's gaze flicked to James's hand, then back to his eyes. Something in that look drained the swagger from his stance. He stepped back, boots scraping the dirt, muttering, "No need to get all riled." James said nothing more. Mick turned on his heel and strode back toward his companions, who pretended not to watch him return. The air seemed to loosen again. Isabel's next customer, a gray-haired man in a wool coat, stepped forward and asked about her honey, as though nothing had happened. Through the rest of the afternoon, James stayed nearby but out of the way, his presence a quiet anchor. Isabel sold most of her produce, though a few baskets of apples and squash remained. When the crowd thinned and the last coins were counted, she began to gather her things. Without a word, James stepped in, lifting the remaining baskets as if they weighed nothing, stacking them neatly in the back of her wagon. She reached for one, but he shook his head and finished the work himself. Then he placed a small sack on the wagon seat, a bag of coffee beans, the scent rich and earthy even through the burlap. "For your trouble," he said simply. Before she could reply, he tipped his hat and turned away, heading down the street toward the edge of town. Isabel stood by the wagon for a long moment, watching him go. Around her, the market wound down, merchants packing up, voices fading with the day. She rested her hand on the coffee sack, feeling its weight. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she hadn't faced the whispers and sharp edges of the town alone. Dash dash dash. The wind that swept across the Carter ranch carried the bite of late autumn, rattling the dry stalks in the fields and whistling through gaps in the barn walls. Isabel had been closing the shutters in the kitchen when she noticed a folded scrap of paper wedged beneath the doorframe. No name, no address, just her own breath clouding the air as she bent to pick it up. She opened it by the light of the stove. The handwriting was jagged, as though scrawled in haste. "Keep letting that gunman hang around, and you'll regret it. A woman's reputation is a fragile thing. Yours will shatter soon enough." Asterisk. The first letter she burned, telling herself it was some fool's crude attempt to unsettle her. But the next night, there was another. This one sharper, uglier, naming her outright and promising that accidents happen to women who don't know their place. The third warned that her friend would bring trouble to her door. By the fourth, her hands shook as she held the paper over the flame, watching the ink curl and blacken. That was when the back door opened, and James stepped in, brushing dust from his coat. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the smoke rising from the stove. "Nothing important," she said too quickly, tucking the last of the ash under the grate. His eyes narrowed. "Isabel." She hesitated, then sighed, pulling open a drawer where two other folded notes lay hidden. He read them without a word, his jaw tightening with each line. "You should have told me," he said, voice low but steady. "They're just words," she replied. "If we confront whoever's doing this, it'll only feed them. Or stop them," James countered. "Cowards count on silence." Her gaze dropped. "I don't want the girls hearing about this." The matter seemed to rest there, though his expression told her he wasn't letting it go. 2 nights later, Sophie and Clara came running into the house, cheeks flushed, eyes wide. "Papa," Clara whispered, "there's someone by the barn." James didn't waste time. He took the lantern from its hook, stepped into the cold, and was halfway across the yard before Isabel caught up to the doorway. A shadow darted between the stacks of hay. James moved fast for a man his size, cutting the figure off before it could reach the fence. There was a scuffle, the lantern swinging wildly, then James's voice, sharp, commanding. Moments later, he emerged, one large hand gripping the collar of a man she recognized instantly, Mick Dalton. His face was pale under the lantern light, his hat askew. James held a crumpled paper in his other hand. "This yours?" James asked, shaking it open. Mick said nothing, but his glare toward Isabel spoke louder than words. By morning, word had spread. James didn't drag Mick to the sheriff's office right away. Instead, he led him, wrists bound with rope, straight into the center of town. The square was already busy, merchants unpacking crates, townsfolk fetching supplies. James stopped in the middle of the street and held up the paper. "Read it," he ordered. Mick shifted on his feet. "No." James took one step closer, the rope between his hands tightening. "Read it." The crowd's chatter dimmed. Mick's voice was low at first, stumbling over the words, but James's stillness left him nowhere to hide. By the time he reached the last line, threatening what happens to women who keep the wrong company, the square had gone silent. Isabel stood at the edge of the crowd, her chin lifted, though her heart pounded. She saw the looks people gave Mick, disgust, not curiosity. Sheriff Cole stepped forward, taking the rope from James. "That's enough. He'll spend some time in a cell while we talk about charges." As they led Mick away, James turned toward Isabel. There was no boast in his eyes, no triumph, only a quiet certainty, the same look he'd worn when fixing her fence or leaving a sack of coffee on her wagon seat. The whispers that had followed her for weeks didn't vanish that morning, but something shifted. The town had seen with their own eyes who had been behind the filth slid under her door, and who had stood in front of her when it mattered. The night was eerily quiet. Even the crickets had fallen silent. Isabel had just banked the kitchen fire when a sharp, acrid scent caught her attention. She frowned, looking toward the window, where an orange flicker danced against the dark beyond the orchard. "James," she called, already moving toward the door. By the time he reached the porch, pulling on his boots, the flicker had grown into a towering flame. The hay barn was ablaze, sparks shooting high into the night sky. "Get the girls," James ordered, leaping off the porch. Isabel hurried to wake Sophie and Clara. Their eyes widened at the fire's glow, but they clung quietly to her hands as she led them safely to the well house. James stood at the barn doors, his shirt covering his mouth against the choking smoke. Isabel joined him, bucket in hand, ignoring his protest to stay back. Together, they passed buckets and beat back the flames pushed by the wind toward the corral. The thick smoke stung their eyes and lungs, but they didn't stop. James hacked at the burning wall with a shovel to create a break. Isabel stumbled in the churned mud, but he grabbed her arm and steadied her without missing a beat. When the fire was finally subdued to smoldering piles, half the hay was lost, but the rest stood in a blackened, leaning wall. Isabel coughed, leaning heavily on the doorframe. James's gaze locked on a set of deep, wide tracks in the mud, none belonging to them. He crouched, running fingers over a dark stain that gleamed faintly in the moonlight, then raised his hand to his nose. "Kerosene," he muttered. Isabel's stomach dropped. "You mean someone set this fire?" James's voice was flat and dangerous. "Yes." Before she could respond, he was already heading toward the pasture gate, lantern swinging at his side, following the tracks into the trees. Isabel called after him, but the wind swallowed her words. The trail led past the creek and over the ridge to a cluster of lanterns marking Brock Hanley's cattle camp. Brock leaned casually against a rail as James arrived. Well, he sneered. "Didn't expect a visitor this late. Heard you're playing farmhand for the Carter widow." James stopped a few steps away, the lantern's light highlighting the sharp line of his jaw. "You set that fire." Brock smirked. "Or maybe your lady friend left her lantern too close to the haystack." "Her name's Isabel," James replied evenly. "And you'll admit what you did now." Brock stepped forward, his smirk fading to a sneer. "You going to draw on me? I hear you hung up your gun years ago after your brother took a bullet for you." James's eyes didn't waver. "No, gun." He dropped the lantern into the dirt. "We'll settle this with our fists." Brock swung first, a wild arc aimed to end it quickly. James ducked and jabbed Brock's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. They circled on gravel, their breaths harsh in the night air, the cattle restless nearby. Brock lunged, catching James's shoulder, but James twisted and punched Brock's jaw, then drove a fist into his gut. Brock staggered and tried to grab James's collar but was slammed against the rail hard enough to crack the wood. James pinned Brock, pressing a forearm to his throat. "You're going to sign it." Brock's burning eyes met his with hatred but nodded reluctantly. Inside the dim ranch office, James pushed a paper and pen toward Brock, a confession admitting he set the fire to damage Isabel's livelihood. Brock's signature trembled beneath James's unblinking stare. When finished, James folded the paper and pocketed it. Brock rubbed his throat but avoided James's gaze. "Stay off her land," James warned quietly. "Next time, I won't be so polite." Without another word, James turned and disappeared into the cold night, the confession safe in his coat. Brock's bitter curses faded behind him. At dawn, James returned to the Carter ranch, where Isabel waited, the girls close by her side. He handed her the paper without speaking. Her breath caught as she read, then looked up at him. He only gazed past her toward the barn, calculating what remained. The fire was meant to break her spirit, but instead, it drew a line no one in town could ignore. The courthouse in Milford was a squat brick building with tall windows that let in pale winter light. By mid-morning, every bench inside was full, ranchers in dusted coats, shopkeepers on their break, and townsfolk who never missed a public fight. The scrape of boots on the wooden floor echoed as the bailiff called the session to order. Brock Hanley sat at the plaintiff's table, his dark suit too tight across the shoulders, jaw set in a smirk meant to project confidence. Across from him, James sat beside Isabel, his hat resting on his knee, expression unreadable. A thin man in a tailored coat, James's lawyer from Denver, sorted papers into a neat stack. Judge Fletcher, gray-haired and square-jawed, looked over the docket. Hanley versus Carter, claim of disputed ownership over the south lot of the Carter Ranch. His eyes lifted to Brock. "You may begin." Brock's attorney rose, launching into a speech about boundary markers and poor management of the Carter property. He painted Isabel as a widow clinging to land she could not maintain, suggesting the south lot would be better served under Brock's care. When it was the defense's turn, the Denver lawyer stood smoothly. "Your Honor, before we address the boundary dispute, I have evidence regarding the plaintiff's conduct toward my client." He handed the judge a folded document. Fletcher unfolded it, eyes scanning the page. "This is a signed confession from Mr. Hanley admitting to setting fire to the defendant's hay barn. Signed in his own hand," the lawyer confirmed, and corroborated by sworn testimony from one McDalton, currently in custody for harassment and trespassing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brock shifted in his seat, color rising in his cheeks. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Hanley, is this your signature?" Brock hesitated, then muttered, "Yes, but..." "You will have your turn to explain," Fletcher said curtly. He turned to Isabel. "Mrs. Carter, would you like to make a statement?" Isabel rose slowly. Her hands were steady, though her heart thudded in her chest. She looked out over the room, at faces she had seen in the general store, in church, at the market. "This ranch was my husband's, and before that, his father's," she began. "Since his passing, I have worked every day to keep it alive. I've mended fences in the rain, brought in cattle during storms, planted and harvested until my hands bled. And I have done it while raising my head to face every rumor, every whisper that I could not manage on my own." Her eyes shifted briefly to James. "Mr. Rowan has stood by me when others would not. He has protected my land, my safety, and the children who come and go between our homes. This ranch is not just acres and posts. It is my life, and I will not see it taken by deceit." There was a moment of stillness in the courtroom, broken only by the creak of a bench. Judge Fletcher leaned back. "The court finds that the plaintiff's actions, specifically the arson and harassment, invalidate his claim on the disputed property. The case for ownership of the south lot is dismissed. Furthermore, Mr. Hanley will pay damages for the destruction of the defendant's property and serve 30 days in county jail." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Brock's mouth opened, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm, shaking his head. The deputies were already moving toward him. For a heartbeat, there was only the shuffle of papers and the scrape of chairs. Then, someone at the back clapped once. Another joined in. The sound spread until the whole room was filled with the applause of neighbors who, for the first time, weren't whispering about Isabel Carter. They were standing for her. James glanced at her, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. Isabel met his eyes, feeling the weight of months of battles fought in shadow lift just enough to let her breathe. Outside, the cold air was bright and sharp. The crowd spilled onto the steps, still talking about the verdict. Somewhere behind them, the jailhouse door shut on Brock Hanley. For the first time in a long while, Isabel felt the ground under her feet is truly her own. The days after the trial stretched long and quiet. Isabel kept busy on the ranch, mending fences and tending to the fields, but there was an emptiness where James's steady presence had been. He had left town without a word, riding off toward the distant hills with Sophie and Clara trailing behind. Though she masked it well, Isabel's nights were restless. The silence in the house was heavier without the soft footsteps of the twins and the low murmur of James's voice. She found herself staring out the window, hoping to see a dust cloud or the glint of horses approaching from the horizon. One crisp morning, just as the sun was lifting the frost from the ground, a familiar sound broke the stillness, the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the dirt road. Isabel's heart leapt. She stepped onto the porch, her eyes searching the road that led to the farm. James appeared first, tall and sure, dust settling from his coat. Sophie and Clara bounced beside him, their laughter ringing clear as they ran ahead to the gate. In James's hand was a small, worn box, its edges smooth from years of handling. He opened it carefully and revealed a silver ring, simple, unadorned, but polished to a quiet gleam. "This belonged to my mother," he said, voice steady but soft. "I don't promise you a life free of storms or hard days, but I promise you this, I will never let you face those days alone again." Isabel's breath caught, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. She reached out, slipping the ring onto her finger, the weight of it grounding her like nothing else could. Sophie and Clara ran to her side, throwing their arms around both of them. "Mama," they whispered, their smiles bright and unguarded. The four stood together on the porch as the morning sun warmed the earth beneath their feet. Later that day, Isabel and James took to the fields with a sack of seeds between them, the first of the season. They scattered them over the softened soil, side by side, hands occasionally brushing, sharing small smiles and quiet words. The wind rustled through the golden grasses, carrying their laughter across the open land. In that moment, beneath the vast, endless sky of the western plains, they planted more than just crops. They planted hope, a future shaped by courage, by love, and by the quiet strength of two people choosing to build something lasting together. Thank you for joining us on this journey through love, courage, and resilience on the wild frontier. Isabel and James's story reminds us that even in the toughest times, hope can take root and grow into something beautiful. If you enjoyed this tale of heart and hardship in the Old West, please subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable romances that capture the spirit of America's untamed past. Hit the like button, share with